My name is Cam Cullen. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer for BlastWave. And I will be introducing here shortly my compatriot Joe Baxter, who's one of the solution architects for BlastWave to do a demo. But what we want to talk about today is how to protect OT networks from the rising threat of not only just simple hackers, but also AI-powered hacking. And I'll talk a little bit about why we're saying that's an issue specifically. And when you take a step back, the question really for everyone is, why do we need to protect these OT networks or critical infrastructure? And why is this any different than it has been in the past? And the answer is because the danger to critical infrastructure is escalating, and the impact of having critical infrastructure get impacted is worse than it used to be. And the reason why it's getting worse is that, first of all, we have this kind of in the manufacturing space, what they call Industry 4.0 and the connected worker. But the bottom line is everything is much more connected than it used to be. Devices, whether they're OT, they're IoT, they're IoT, everything wants to be connected and wants to be talking either to some controller or even increasingly talking to the cloud. And the OT protection that was put in place to protect these assets, not IT assets, but the OT assets, it's not working. The hacks just continue to increase. Gen AI and the assistance of AI and helping hackers do their job is making it harder because offensive AI is way ahead of defensive AI. And then finally, from a geopolitical perspective, the landscape in politics is probably the worst it's been in quite some time. It doesn't matter what country you live in. And this is resulting in increased cyber activity, not just attacks, but if you remember a few years ago, Christopher Wray, was the previous head of the FBI, called that the threat that Chinese companies and Chinese cyber programs specifically was the defining threat of our generation. And it was not only because of attacks, but it was because they were pre-positioning themselves inside of networks should they ever decide to do anything. And that is a danger. And what we've even seen happening in this year, this is from a Forescout Research Labs research report showing the top target industries. And a lot of these industries are what we would consider OT or critical infrastructure, government, telecommunications. If you happen to see, yesterday they took down a SIM farm, essentially in New York City, that could have taken down the cell network. It was not a hack, but it was a vulnerability that they recognized. We can just overload the infrastructure with basically SMSs to cause a problem. Energy, manufacturing, healthcare, retail, education. So all of these networks, everything is under attack. There is no industry that is immune from this. And a lot of people we see in the OT space, what I'll call the escape valve is, well, no one's looking for us. We're not going to get attacked. We're kind of immune to that. And I wanted I want to present a case study, but then later on, Joe's going to do a demonstration of this. A company called Forescout, who I just quoted a second ago, they did an interesting test. They put a honeypot online that was acting as a water treatment plant. Wasn't advertised. It wasn't something people could look up and then would go searching for. It wasn't something that would be targeted because someone had a bad brand experience with and who were angry at them. It was just a random set of IPs that were on the internet. And over a 90-day period, they essentially received over 1.4 million requests or scans, essentially at about 11 per minute, where automated systems on the internet were looking for open IPs or problems or challenges. And Joe's going to show this, but if you think that your network isn't important enough, or you're not substantial, or you're not on someone's radar screen, you are. One of the very interesting comments I've seen in this space is the well, we've got a firewall, we're good. And we're going to talk a lot about how that's probably the wrong attitude to take, because what we see is that the reality of the attack and storm landscape now is already bad. If you watch the news on a regular basis, either OT networks themselves are hit, the IT network for a company is hit and is used as a transit into the OT network. I've seen statistics say that as many as 75% of OT attacks originate from the IT side of the house. And then finally, the IT network gets hit and causes so much disruption that the entire system gets taken down, and the denial of service to the product or the service that's being provided by the company that runs this critical infrastructure is impacted. And water is a very good example of this. Water utilities have a lot of challenges. They have very legacy devices. They have a low staff, so they are a big target. And anyone that's ever turned on their water faucet and got no water knows that's a problem. So the landscape is already bad. The worst news is it's getting worse. When you look at what the abilities that these AI assistants, that Gen AI and other tools bring, it takes existing capable hackers, whether they're nation state, whether they're a cybercrime group, makes them more capable than they already are. And it can, and from a nightmare perspective, especially for a brand or a manufacturing company, people who know nothing about hacking can use these tools to cause you trouble and conduct pretty sophisticated campaigns against you, because their store wouldn't accept their mattress return, or they get mad at a brand because something broke on one of their electronic devices. And I think the danger here is that what I would call the front end of hacking has become highly automated. The reconnaissance, the social engineering, the phishing, all these tools. And I was at a conference a month or so ago where the CEO of Huntress, which is a cybersecurity firm, presented. And his comment was that criminal firms don't have to get involved in the cyber attack chain, essentially, until the time comes to determine what the ransom is. So all the reconnaissance is done automatically. All of the social engineering, the phishing, all of that stuff is done. And essentially what the cyber criminals presented with are, here's everything about this network. Here's how much cyber insurance they have. Here's their revenue. Here's what we think they could basically pay and ransom. So just send the letter out. So they don't have to do anything. So what we want to do is, if we take a step back, how can we stop that kind of cyber attack? Because that's the dangerous one, where no one even has to get involved. You can just press a button and it's basically attacking an entire industry or an entire company. So what we did at BlastWave is we took a first principles thinking approach to this. What is the problem we want to solve? What are the pieces of the problem, and how do we try and address all of those pieces? Then we challenge these assumptions that are out there in the market today, and how do we create a new solution from the ground up? And when I say from the ground up, I don't mean let's create some revolutionary technology that no one's ever heard of before and has to take time to learn it. What are the pieces that we can assemble from existing technologies that we can combine in a way that no one's thought of before to make a better solution? So first, let's look at the problem. So the attack surface for critical infrastructure and OT networks, it's a 360-degree problem. From the north, you have hackers, Gen AI, reconnaissance, people coming from the outside who are trying to get into your network. A place where firewalls are traditionally been thought of as the solution, but frankly not doing the job. You also have, from the west, you have your own employees that you're trying to let into your network that are getting their credentials stolen. They're clicking on phishing emails that are supposed to be protected by VPNs and privileged access management solutions. Those are not working. You also have your good employees or employees that get in, they're already in the network. Now they turn malicious for some reason and they want to move laterally and cause damage to your network. Again, the firewalls and the privileged access management systems don't always stop those people, and we see hacks resulting or data breaches, etc., coming from that. But we also can't forget attacks coming from the south. So essentially, you think of a maintenance worker. Either they get maintenance remote access in and get access to devices, or someone physically goes in, plugs a USB into a device, and now that device becomes infected. They can now move laterally. They can infect and malware throughout the network. So if you want to solve the problem, you have to solve all four of these different threat vectors to be able to deliver security solutions. If you asked a customer what they wanted to solve this, they would probably say, we want a better firewall with a better VPN. So you would say, I kind of know what I have. But BlastWave is actually founded by Tom Sego, who worked for both Steve Jobs and Tim Cook at Apple. And one of the guiding principles that he had when he founded BlastWave was to think about, it's hard for customers to tell you what they want when they've never seen anything remotely like it. And I use this quote not just to kind of for Tom to honor kind of where he came from, but this is the kind of response we get when we present our solution to customers. So it's not like anything you've seen. So when we describe, for example, what is network cloaking, they think, oh, network cloaking, that's just, you're just a better firewall, you're a firewall, right? You're doing a little bit of NAT, so that's cloaking. But what we've done actually with BlastWave is we've taken existing technology, and I use drones as an example. Drones, when I used to think of drones, I thought of, hey, the little things you can fly around and take pictures of your yard and your pool and the forest, etc. But when you think about drones today, this is often what comes to mind, where these are military drones, they have explosives, they're swarming existing military equipment. In fact, there's a lot of discussion of, do you even need some of these manned systems now, because these drones are doing way better at their job and cheaper and safer than you would if you had a human in a tank or something going around. So this is kind of the model we had, where we took a bunch of different technologies. And if you're really interested in the details of how we use each one of these technologies, I invite you to download the white paper that I mentioned. But we took a little bit of network address translation, not as a address conservation technique, but the obfuscation and weaponization of NAT, which says I'm going to use NAT to control access into devices and make it very hard for people to get to them, because the only route to get to them is through me. We also do some interesting things with layer 2 segmentation. So we can take, with cloaking, an entirely flat layer 2 network, and if you have a managed switch and you connect us to it, we can actually micro-segment that entire layer 2 flat network down to the device level with our software-defined solution. We also, obviously, we use layer 3 routing, so we are creating an SDN across a WAN. So you're now basically pushing policies down to devices to tell them how to route their traffic to get to the devices that they need to. Critically, there's encryption. So many OT devices conduct their traffic in clear text without any encryption whatsoever in the protocols. So we encrypt those, including things like passwords get passed in clear text between devices. So if someone happens to get access to that layer 2 feed, they can decode and they have the password, and they can now get to that device however they want. We use a lot of software-defined networking technology. As you'll see when I describe the overlay, we were trying to get past the firewall problem of having to reconfigure devices and IP addresses and ports and VLANs on devices every time we wanted to make a change. So we wanted to do this in a very different way to get there. And then finally, to cover some of that east-west, north-south challenge, we wanted to have a way to get secure remote access into that network at the identity level, and specifically to make it passwordless. So we don't want credentials to be able to be stolen. So to build cloaking, you kind of mix all that together, and now you have something that we think and what our customers tell us is a pretty unique solution that they can do and fix many of the problems they have in their network without all of the overhead and pain that they have. So let's get to the good stuff now. We now have a solution. It involves this network cloaking. It includes passwordless secure remote access and some software-defined networking segmentation. Although these are three different technologies, they have to be together to work right. So I can't just band-aid a passwordless remote access onto a cloak and a segmentation and expect it to work. It has to be a single point of view. And I'll give you one final analogy before I get into how cloaking works for all the geeks in the audience, since there often is in these type of environments. Anyone who's a Lord of the Rings fan remembers the scene where they wanted to get into Moria, and they went to the doors of Durin. And all there was in front of them was a big rock. And unless Gandalf knew there was a door there, he knew the Elven language, and he knew how to solve the riddle and secret to get that door to A, first appear, and then B, to actually say the right word to get the door to open. There was no visible view of that door. And this is kind of like what cloaking is. There is a path into a network that unless you know the secret phrase, you're not going to get that door to appear. In this case would be your authentication to our system. And then B, how to get that door open is to actually authenticate yourself. So let's talk about now the good stuff about how cloaking works. So the most important thing about network cloaking is that you don't have to touch the devices that are sitting on your network. So the biggest problem we hear for customers who are worried about implementing segmentation or trying to do Purdue model with firewalls at every layer, or do IEC 62443, or even just they hear the word segmentation and heaven forbid micro-segmentation, they immediately say, well, I can't do that. It's too much work. It's going to take me years. I have to do downtime, which in the OT space is a big no-no. Cloaking says, leave all of that the way it is. And what we want to do is build on top of that a secure overlay. And we want to make your WAN, multi-site, multi-device, multi-network, look like a LAN. So how do we do that? Well, if you know anything about SDNs or how that work, what we do essentially is we take that underlay network, which is the internal network or the addresses that are already configured on your devices, and we map them to an overlay. So we NAT. We say, okay, this device at the underlay is one address, and when we move it to the overlay, it's a new address. What that does is saying that the only way to get to these devices is to go through the Blast Shield gateway, which can be redundant and meshed, and there's different ways to get there. So we take all the gateways that are on the network, we create a mesh between them using the orchestrator to create the routes dynamically between these, including the fact that if one gateway is down, you can use other gateways to route to that. So it truly is a mesh network with multi-path capabilities, not single route. And because it's secure, it's actually all of these connections are encrypted. So if you are oil and gas, for example, and you're worried about going over an untrusted public network like the cellular network, which by the way has a Salt Typhoon problem where we're not sure if the communications across those networks are secure, you have an encrypted network. So how does this secure overlay communicate? So details, again, the white paper has this kind of explained out as well, but the devices on the network, rather than kind of defaulting to IP, you can use a dynamic DNS type technology. You do lookups for devices. You broadcast that, what's the DNS for this? The gateway, it actually handles that DNS, gives out the alias addresses to the devices, creates the path between the two gateways, which enables these two devices to connect. So as you can see, the overlay and the underlay addresses basically go across, resolve that. So you can have devices that are on separate sites. In this case, as we see here, we have a 192, 168, 100, on two different sites that are communicating across the WAN, even though they're the exact same address. They communicate as if they were on the same LAN on that network. So that creates the ability to talk across and to handle that. In fact, this ability to handle multiple overlapping IP addresses is very important for businesses that may basically want to expand by acquiring a new company. We had a customer, for example, that acquired a new asset from another company, and that site had the exact same address settings for all of their devices as was across the rest of the company, and they were able to, within basically a week's time, to pull that new location into by creating basically a new overlay address for that site and not changing any of the IPs on a local perspective and making it very rather than having to send an IT person to go in and handle firewall changes and routing. They just shipped them the gateway. They scanned the gateway with a camera. It was added to the orchestrator, and then they could configure all the devices remotely. So this ability to not have to change IP addresses and to handle overlapping addresses makes cloaking a natural fit for rapid network changes. And it's not just for the devices that are here. I mentioned before about having remote access into this, whether it's employees or maintenance workers. We can also take and add passwordless remote access users to this network on a dynamic basis. And what's important about this is every single user has their own unique policy as they get in, or they inherit a group policy based upon the users they are, so that it's not based upon their IP range that they're handed out that they get it. It's based upon their identity, that their policies. So in this case, we have remote workers coming in. They're added to the overlay network. And what happens is for each one of these users, they are given route policies to say which devices that they're allowed to see on the network and what devices they can't see. So if a remote access user A comes in and tries to either he adds a route manually or he just tries to ping one of these other overlay addresses or even an underlay address, he has no access to that. So he is prevented with least privilege access and zero trust to get to those. So it also keeps your remote workers segmented from getting to the things that they are not supposed to see. And what you result in, especially when you think of it from a remote access users, you get a group of devices or a device or a group of users or a user that now are looked at from a policy perspective as a flat mesh. It's not about the routes that it has to go through or how many firewalls and how many holes do I have to poke in all the firewalls to make sure all the devices can talk. It's, I want my admin users to be able to talk to the control zones and not let them talk to maybe the process information zone. So you can set all of these policies. It looks like a flat thing, and each one of these categories or groups can have thousands of users in it. We have policies at some of our customers that have 5,000 devices or users in a single policy. And if you add a new user to that, it inherits the policies of all, or if I add a device, it's very simple. So this is critical because it allows you to scale to the sizes of networks that a traditional firewall policy engine would essentially die trying to handle. So cloaking, not only does it provide kind of the seamless ability to protect, but it also allows you to scale up an OT. So I've talked a little bit about how this works. What I'd like to do now is have Joe tell you, show you how it works. So I'm going to stop sharing. Joe, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you start your demo now.
Great. All right. Hello, everybody. I'm Joe Baxter, Solutions Architect here. And believe if everybody can see my screen effectively. This is my orchestrator. What I'm going to do is just walk you down exactly what Cam was talking about. So the average network is pretty flat and open, something maybe like this, where you have a north side and a south side, multiple locations, sometimes, connected by a firewall or firewalls. a lot of times with different subnets. And the problem is that if anybody from the outside can get into this network, they pretty much have free range access, can go anywhere they want, laterally, and sometimes even up and down the stack. An example of this would be exposed data from a Shodan engine. So I've got a couple of different searches here, but let's see if we can find something. I'm going to search for the city of San Diego. I'm also going to just look maybe for port 80, just because I happen to have a good example of that already. We'll look at port 80. No particular thoughts in mind here. Let's see what this guy looks like. There's one that has some open ports advertised on the internet here in San Diego for open ports there. And if you go back here, you'll notice there's 29,000 responding devices just with the search that I looked for. Here's one. Heavenlyproductions.net really needs to close something down. And by the way, I'm not entering these devices. I'm just searching for what they're revealing on Shodan. Here's a couple other searches that I've done before. Here's one with a few ports open, but notice tons of CVEs that were exposed by these few open ports that Shodan just in a random search happened to find. Here's one, I think in Boston perhaps. And again, tons of ports available, including port 80. Let's investigate that. I have a network running right here. You can see through the eyes of this camera. And there's a couple of Moxa RTUs in this network. Now, this is the most common Moxa RTU that I could find based upon different SCADA forums, particularly the inductive automation forum. I queried there to see what everybody thought the most common RTU was. And so let's see what we can do here. So let's pretend like this device was attached to that network. I'm just going to open up a simple Wireshark and listen on an interface for only post commands. So I'm only looking at for the post. This would be a port 80 type interaction. On this same device, I'm going to simulate. I could do it on a different device, but just so we don't have to switch screens here. This is a Moxa iLogic. This is actually this device down here on the bottom, hiding over here on the right. That is a Moxa iLogic 8x8 digital RTU. You'll notice there's no security, so it's not HTTPS. It's port 80 HTTP. No username. Simple 4-character password. By the way, it's the default password. When I hit submit on this device, you'll notice immediately over here, not only does it log in, everything seems fine on the login page, but over here in this packet sniffer, it immediately captured a packet, which includes the password. It's a hashed value, but a simple rainbow library could quickly decode that out of that hashed value and give me that 4-character password. That's the problem with flat and open networks, particularly with flat and open networks that may be exposed to the internet. So what do? Put BlastWave in place. Now the Blast Shield gateways hide these devices and cloak all of these devices under here. So on this network that I'm running, if I come over here and do a scan, I can see all of these devices underneath. That's the power switch, an HMI, a couple of RTUs, a switch, things like that. I can have full operation of this device. So if I'm an attacker and I've gained access to this network, maybe I could set an error condition or open up a relay or a breaker or turn off a system. You'll notice that these devices, they're talking, they're pinging, not on the underlay, but over the Blast Shield overlay. What happens if I very simply go through my Blast Shield interface? And by the way, this is my orchestrator interface. This is the start of our cryptography. This is the start of our policy engine here, that this device right here, this Blast Shield orchestrator. By the way, I can have multiple orchestrators working in a team, so I have great high availability. I take each of those gateways and I map my endpoints behind it using their original IP addresses, no software installed, to enable this cloaking. I can even intercept fully qualified domain names, which is what Cam was talking about with different companies and acquisition, constantly adding new networks. Using an FQDN or a DNS name is really, really effective to help simplify that, especially when the underlay address, the original IP address, all has the same numbers. I provide an overlay address onto BlastShield, and what I do is I take all of those devices, I throw them into simple groups, I define my services, my ports and policies or my ports and services. And by the way, not just something that would an IT type technology would see with TCP and UDP. I have entire suites of protocols, including routing protocols and OT protocols that the average IT solution would not even have any knowledge of. I take those groups, I take those policies, and I take those groups and I take those services and I group them together in a policy, such as this one, that enables that user on the Windows PC that we saw just a moment ago to be able to talk to all of these devices. What happens when I just turn that policy off? I'll save these changes, quickly change over to this window. Watch down here in this ping window. It'll shut off, and right about there it goes. No more pinging. If I try to get to this control point, operate this device, it's not there anymore. When I scan again, everything's cloaked except for the camera that we're looking through. I left that on purpose. Everything else is hidden. Everything else is cloaked. Everything else is, and I'll say virtually undiscoverable, but quite frankly, I think it is effectively undiscoverable. That's been tested by DoD Purple teams for effectiveness. They were not able to find or discover any of these devices that are being cloaked and protected by the BlastShield gateways. Now, getting access to this as I'm using a north-south perspective of access. I'm coming in from the outside using this Windows PC. That would be symbolized up here by this client. That would be a secure remote access perspective to come through this gateway and talk to these devices. That very quickly and easily is made through the BlastShield client. Right now I'm connected to these things, but if I disconnect and use our mobile app very easily to connect to this device. Let me share my phone screen just so everybody can see that happen. I'm going to use my BlastShield orchestra or my BlastShield authenticator. There we are right there. Move this out of the way. Grab that QR code. I'm going to tell it that I want to get back into that demo net and click OK. It gets my Face ID off of my phone. That's that multi-factor authentication, and I'm connected. So it's just that easy, and no usernames, no passwords, phishing resistant multi-factor authentication very quickly, very easily to get connected to this network. All right, Cam.
All right, thanks, Joe. So I will start to share again. So what Joe has kind of shown you, it's a very quick demo of how the idea of cloaking that I presented actually works in practice. If you want a demo of that, certainly feel free to reach out to us. But it's really important that you could see, he showed basically a free internet tool that could be used to scan an entire city to find things that were open. You can dig down, and not only do you see what things you could find, but also the vulnerabilities that were associated with it. So again, in an AI powered thing, all of that happens in the background. It can actually exploit those CVEs, so it knows what's out there. So the real key is at the front end of the attack chain, if they can't find you, they can attack you. So let's do a little bit about, just to make sure I reinforce what Joe said about what do we prevent with our secure overlay or network cloaking technology. If a hacker attempts reconnaissance, they scan, for example, the IP address range. Even if they scan the IT network that this network happens to be sitting on, they're going to get no response from the gateways. Just as the scenario outlaid with Gandalf, the gateway wouldn't appear until he said the magic words. It's the same thing with a remote access user or remote user, unless you have the right handshake PKI offering to the gateway from a validated, essentially invitation or request, you will get no response whatsoever. So pings are going to be dropped, silently dropped, not rejected or not anything. So they're black hole. So the user just thinks there's nothing there. the system that they're trying to get into. It essentially creates a virtual air gap. And for those in the OT world who pine for the days where you just disconnected your network, your OT side from the internet, and life was good because no one could get into it. This allows you to do that in a virtual way so that they can all still talk, and people who are allowed to get in can get in, but everyone else can't get into the OT network from the outside, and hackers can't discover it. So that's a great way to drastically reduce the noise. So anyone that has threat management or SIEM or IDS systems or IPS that are out there, and the noise from just scans and attacks is constant, that essentially drops to nothing because no one can get into that network now. There is no opportunity to scan that. So it is a work saver from that perspective by removing the noise from your system. So what happens if a hacker gets physical access to like a Wi-Fi network in your factory? Or they go plug into a port because they happen to sneak into a conference room, or maybe someone in the lobby leaves a port open and not paying attention to what they do. Well, in that case, the user ends up connecting to that flat layer 2 network. However, in a micro segmented or segmented case, that port or that user can only talk to the gateway. He cannot scan and see the rest of the devices on the network, as Joe demonstrated in his part of the demo, where you can't just do a ping scan to get responses. You have to be authorized by the gateway to talk to even things on your layer 2 network, because we are acting almost as a one-armed router inside that VLAN or that flat layer 2 network. So that hacker, even though he's gained physical access or logical access in a Wi-Fi scenario, he still cannot get to the rest of those devices on the network. So when you think of the north and the south have just been taken care of by this particular solution. And what happens about that east-west that we talked about? What if a remote access user, or even someone that has, for God's sake, let's assume you don't have passwordless SRA and you use some other login with our client, which if you caught Joe's demo, we do allow SSO, we allow FIDO key, so we do allow other techniques if that happens to fit your business desires. But what if that user gets in, steals a credential, or gets on the network because they're authorized and decide they want to do malicious things? Well, we can stop that unauthorized lateral movement by doing the microsegmentation and not allowing devices to talk to things that they're not supposed to. So there's no ping response. As Joe said, he was in the network, but he tried to ping or talk to those other devices that he knew were there, but he still couldn't get to them. So it allows you to not only protect your network from outside, it also allows you to protect your network from the inside.
And one of the fundamental, Cam, excuse me for interrupting, but one of the fundamental things to take away from the way the Blast Shield Gateway works is we do not pass ever any unauthenticated or unencrypted traffic except by an explicit egress policy. We never allow incoming traffic. So one of the reasons why we're so hidden and so invisible to scans with this cloaking technology is the way we've developed the IP stack and the way we deal with unencrypted and unauthorized packets is to silently drop them, and in such a way that you can't even detect that there's an interface on the network.
And that's really important. So again, visually speaking, it's like today, the OT networks, you're advertising an open house. Come on in, check everything out, doors open, or at least I can peek through the windows. I can go through those blinds and see what's happening. A Cloak network, it might just look like a vacant lot, like there's nobody there. Like maybe it's for sale. But if you happen to have the right way to look into the network, you can discover that there is really a network behind it. Now, one of the questions that we get asked all the time, well, isn't a fire, it's just NAT, right? Well, I hope that you see, based upon kind of the explanation that you'll see, it's not just NAT. And firewalls may do pieces of cloaking, but they don't really do the entirety of cloaking. So they still leave those holes. It's not a 360-degree solution like we're talking about here. NAT is not cloaking. Yes, it's using NAT for obfuscation in some ways, but it's traditionally using it for address conservation, and devices don't have dedicated addresses. Yes, they can only be either the holes that get poked out from the inside can go out to the internet. So you're thinking that's good, but oh yeah, by the way, if someone comes in, plugs in a USB port, infects it with malware, now that malware can phone home through the firewall through the port that it allowed to open by that device, because it's port 80 or port 443, and they can talk to its command and control server and get instructions on what to do when they want to be activated. So just doing that doesn't mean you're doing cloaking. If you think about the firewall sandwich that you have in a Purdue model, where you have 3 or 4 firewalls in a row, figuring, well, I have 4 of them. There's only one very small path through that. That's not software defined. If you need to add a new device, Joe will tell you how many times he's seen any rules in the firewall, because it's too hard to figure out which ports need to be open for all these connections. So let's just make it bigger, and that's not a software definition for your firewalls. Perimeter defense doesn't stop east-west movement, so it's not a solution that actually solves that problem. Traffic-centric are firewalls. We're talking about identity-centric networks, which are OT. I care about the devices, what they are, their MAC addresses, etc. They don't do that very well. Firewalls are not optimized for OT device. I mentioned some of the sizes of some of these policies that we see in our networks. When you have 10,000 devices in a single rule, good luck trying to manage that in a firewall GUI. Or even as we'll say, what policy is from this address to this address, or this device to this user. In our UI, you can very quickly figure out what the policies are available to there versus having to try and decode that. And finally, the firewalls aren't secure overlay. It's not an SDN. It's not. We're not talking about cloud necessarily here either. People think cloud means that you're doing overlay. That's not the case. Cloud is just another additional of latency, another vulnerability, another connection that has to go out. So BlastWave can be installed in a cloud environment. It can be in a customer prem. It can be in an isolated where there is no internet connectivity at all. All of that is supported. So we do make sure that we protect you from that kind of issue with firewalls. And so that's what we wanted to talk about today. We have, as I mentioned before, there is a white paper on our site that talks about this in more detail. If someone has questions, either technical or otherwise, about BlastWave, feel free to contact me. I would be happy now to take questions from anyone. So if I see one question about the presentation, email me, and I'm happy to give you the presentation and share that. I think it's really important to help people understand one of the differences, I think, and I mentioned this kind of when I had the Steve Jobs quote earlier. Even what Joe showed and what I've talked about doesn't necessarily capture how easy this is to manage for your network versus that firewall sandwich, or multiple firewalls, or layered firewalls, or trying to add new devices to these networks. The proof is in the pudding. And if you don't try it, you'll never know what it's like. We are extremely confident that we've created something that is actually very simple to put together and do that. Actually, Tom asked, there was a question from a Tom on the session, is why isn't anyone able to put these pieces together using ingredients? Well, I'll go back to the first principles thinking that I mentioned. If you look at the problem from a 360-degree point of view, you will find that there are the ingredients are out there. They just have to be put together. One of the problems I think too many people do, if you think of like an RFI, do you protect against X and Y and Z? And individually, that answer might be yes for 3 different products. But if you don't have those things integrated, if, for example, I have to do the handoff from remote access to my my segmentation in a way that is not identity based, I'm leaving a hole. The more complicated it gets, the more likely it is to do that. In fact, someone in the company likes to call that entropy. It's firewall entropy. So the longer a firewall exists, the more likely it is to get sucked into a black hole and have errors. So they have that.
Well,
Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, let me throw something in there. Just, the question was about like the ingredients. And sometimes I think that the idea of these ingredients come from an IT perspective and being applied to an OT space. Speaking, as a former NERC auditor, we saw many audits in the early days of the SIP standards where, there was a standard that required complex passwords. And unfortunately, it required complex passwords to be made up of at least one uppercase, one lowercase, one number, and one symbol. The problem is Windows could do three of those four technologically. And so we wrote a lot of violations because people would turn on complex passwords in Windows and think they were fine, but didn't realize that they couldn't require all four of those conditions or those characteristics. So we saw a lot of that. Now, in the case of, say, like some of the technologies that are out there that are being being applied to a OT world, you've got deep packet inspection and all this and these application layer things that are looking for like Facebook traffic between a SCADA server and a PLC. It's just a wide miss. It's a swing and a miss, and it also increases the latency to an incredible amount when you're doing that type of inspection. So to echo what Cam was saying, this first principles, what really fits in this OT world, and then expand outward instead of trying to pound this round peg into a square hole.
Yeah, and actually, there's a question on the thing about the performance implications. Things like DPI, which again I have a great experience with. I did about say 15 years in the DPI space
Oh,
previously.
by the way, to define that, deep packet inspection. Sorry, I said that, you said it, just in case.
Yep. There is a place for that. So you will have threat management systems that can still be monitoring that OT network in case someone does do something bad. So if a valid user starts doing things he's not supposed to, we as BlastWave are going to allow that to happen because they're valid. They're going to the devices they're supposed to. If they issue a bad command, we won't see that and stop that. So we also work with people like Nozomi or Dragos or other basically detection systems where they're now watching that they're doing DPI in that traffic to see if bad things are actually happening. So we are the front end, your big wall to protect you, but there are other things that you put together to create a full solution. In fact, we are the founding member of a group called the OT Zero Trust Alliance, which is focused on bringing together a number of vendors to, again, not just provide our solution as part of this, but there are other pieces that we plug into this as a company. And we want to make sure that we have partners where you could plug in their solution to ours and not compromise the integrity of the security of your network just because you've used multi-vendors. It's kind of a fallacy to say, oh, well, these big companies can provide me all the solution. And I've seen many cases, and there was actually someone on LinkedIn was posting that the fallacy of that is that what happens is you use one vendor for 80% of your solution, then you have 15 vendors to cover the last 20%. So we acknowledge that that's an issue, but we want to provide, what we want to do is make it as hard as possible to get to that first bit, and then it makes it easier to clean up the back end should there be any issues. All right, it doesn't look like there are any other questions. I definitely want to thank everyone for joining. Feel free to engage us. Send me the email. Again, my email address is cam@blastwave.com if you have any further questions. And thanks for spending some time with us today. And we'll hopefully do this again soon with other neat technology discussions. Thank you.
Thanks.